And good evening, Santa Cruz. My name is, of course, Sandino Gomez, and I'll be your host for tonight's journey through Voices from the Village, community television's longest-running talk television program, bringing a lot of both local, national, international issues right down to a very local level where we get to talk with a lot of really talented, wonderful people to kind of explore various topics all throughout the topicosphere, if that's a word. Tonight we are talking a little bit about kind of hidden housing in Santa Cruz, additional dwelling units, maybe the little granny cottages or in-law cottages as they're often referred to. A lot of the kind of housing stock here in town that really makes it possible for a lot of our city and county's population to enjoy living here in this wonderful, wonderful area and wonderful climate. So with me tonight to explore these to explore this issue are two fabulous guests, I should say, former City Councilman Mark Primack and current City Councilman Micah Posner. You've probably seen them on this very station being covered live in government meetings, CTV, of course, where you can stay informed on kind of what your city councils and school boards are up to here in town. So we're really lucky to have them here on the set tonight live talking about additional dwelling units. And we will be joined, he was delayed in traffic or some other kind of calamity. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but we will also be joined by Mike Rotkin. As soon as he's here, we'll be sure to introduce him and let you call in with your questions. Tonight, October 12th, I guess, we are live, so if you are watching October 12th, please feel free to call in with your questions for our panelists or questions for myself if you want, or if you just want to make a statement about kind of rental stories here in town, both positive and negative. We really want to hear from you. You know, Voices from the Village always makes an attempt to include the public in this discussion. So the number is, of course, 425-8848. Extension 30. Just punch in extension 30. When you get that little robot on the phone, just punch in extension 30, and you'll be connected to us here live on October 12th. And if you're not watching October 12th, well, here's to you. Hope you're having a good one just the same. Welcome, Mark and Micah.
It's nice to be here.
Thanks for having us, Sandino.
Yeah, and you have a particular area of expertise here, Mark. You are, of course, an architect here in town, one of the architects even, if I may say. I've had the pleasure of working with you through the Resource Center for Nonviolence and looking at the 612 Ocean property, but I know you've been involved in lots of things, like the new project over on the west side. I've seen photos of your home and just kind of some of the projects you've been working on, so I'm really interested to pick your brain here tonight about kind of how you see these issues.
Well, I'm a small town architect, and as such, I'm a general practitioner. So I've worked on large projects, I've worked on commercial projects, and I've worked on all levels of housing in this community, and that includes the smallest of the units that we build for ourselves.
Yeah, and ADUs are, I mean, that term is?
Yeah, ADUs are, in our zoning parlance, an ADU is an accessory dwelling ordinance, accessory dwelling unit, and we have an ordinance that guides how we build those. And the ordinance accepts that we have, for the most part, suburban neighborhoods that are low-density neighborhoods. That it is actually in the best interest of neighborhoods to create a larger number of people concentrated to support our public transportation system, our neighborhood stores, schools, and to fight climate change by getting people out of their cars and creating more walkable neighborhoods. So the ADU is an integral part of that plan to create more livable neighborhoods and a more sustainable city.
Yeah. Micah, anything you want to start off with?
I just have I don't have the knowledge Mark does. I do have some specific experience just in terms of where I live. I live in a multi-residential neighborhood with a ton of different types of housing and tons of rental housing in Lower Ocean, south of Broadway. So, you know, when people, you know, talk about how their particular neighborhood is going to be overrun by, you know, housing or students or ADUs, or that's what my neighborhood's like already, and we love it. I mean, it's a great place to raise a family, and it's a wonderful place to live. So that's the only sort of specific experience I bring, is sort of where I live.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're on the city council at the moment, and I understand there was quite the meeting on Tuesday. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you're having us on. It's a really important moment in time for the city, because for many years, like other cities, we've had zoning and building codes that, are imperfect. That we try to achieve certain goals with them, and we try to look out for safety and health and well-being, and then all these other values get jumbled into them, like having housing for cars, garages, and off-site parking. So there's all these values that compete. And then we have an old housing stock in Santa Cruz. So the system's always been imperfect. And that's why for 30 years, people only got in trouble based on the system on a complaint basis. So the system was used for new housing or major renovations, but as far as busting people and kicking them out of their housing because it didn't meet this super complex system of ordinances, it was only when there was a complaint. It was sort of live and let live. So about 4 years ago, Mark, 6 years ago? 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we started just before I got on council, we started the rental inspection program. So now the city staff are actually going out and looking to see if everyone meets all these complicated housing and zoning codes. And it's created a horrible problem where people are losing their homes. I think hundreds of people a year are now losing their homes. So that's where I feel called on, and that's why the city had a special study session, because some of us feel like that's not acceptable and we have to do something different.
Certainly. Well, we are live, and I did tell them to call, so it turns out they've already called. Let's see.
Right.
Are you there, caller? Hello, caller. Are you there? We can hear your music. All right. Technical difficulties. Please do call again. We will try and fix that.
Well,
Go ahead.
let me just jump in. I was at the study session on last Tuesday, and I made this observation that we are a financially conflicted community.
Yeah.
Those of us who own homes in Santa Cruz can't help but be happy to see our housing prices and the value of our homes escalate over the years. That's money in our pockets. We're getting wealth. But we also would like to see our children be able to afford to live here, like to see young, enthusiastic, and idealistic people get a foothold here and be able to make Santa Cruz their home. And the way we've dealt with that conflict in the past is, as Micah said, we have officially as a city turned a blind eye to the kind of self-build affordable housing in Santa Cruz, the garage conversions, the cottages in the backyards, the portions of houses that were separated off and kitchens added. But that is how we as a community have dealt with this housing crisis.
Right.
And as Micah said, it was a don't ask, don't tell policy that really the city was complicit in hundreds, if not thousands of people creating housing in their neighborhoods. And that's a process that really went on for over 30 years. And when I was on the council back in 2002, some of us put a concerted effort into encouraging the creation of ADUs, safe, new ADUs in neighborhoods. And we changed the ordinances, and we changed the way we framed these units. They used to be referred to as illegal units, and people were, they were fearful of the impact it was going to have on their neighborhood. And, but we framed it somewhat differently. We said, these units that you build are places that your children can live in when they become young adults, when they go to Cabrillo, if they go to UCSC, when they're trying to get a foothold in Santa Cruz. These ADUs can actually be granny units, where your aging parents who live hundreds of miles away can come and be close to you in their last years. And in a town where those property values are rising, where homes are investments, they are investments in people's future and their retirements. But unfortunately, we have to sell our homes to cash out, to enjoy our retirement, which means we have to leave. But if we had ADUs, when we become empty nesters, we can move into those self-same small units. We can rent our houses to people so that we don't have to leave Santa Cruz, so that we can continue to maintain the gardens that we created in the neighborhoods that we've lived our lives in. So there was a concerted move back 10 years ago to make it as easy as possible for people to create ADUs. And we saw over 200 new ADUs built. And then, as Micah said, the city, for whatever reason, agreed to a rental inspection ordinance to go after illegal ones, and we have already lost more units than we've gained. And we stand to lose many hundreds more, as Micah said.
I'm just curious, was there also an effort, you mentioned there was an effort to make them easier to build, but was there an effort ever to kind of normalize or legalize the ones that perhaps had been kind of turned a blind eye to? Or is there, perhaps Mike, a question for you, is there an effort or a way that that's politically feasible? I mean, has it happened, Mark? And if not, Micah, what's the possibility?
Well, someone once said that city council members should realistically hope to enact one good piece of legislation in a 4-year term.
Oh,
and my first 4-year term was involved in trying to rewrite the ordinances for ADUs, and that program won many national awards. But I was a one-term city council member. But I let people know that the second phase was the legalization phase.
Yeah.
We had to bring as many units into the fold as we could. We had to make as many of them as safe as we could. And then the ones that were unsafe, the ones that were too far, below par, those are the ones that we had to talk about then abating. So obviously I was horrified when I learned that we'd put the cart before the horse and we're going out to basically abate as many illegal units as we could.
Without
Without
going
that.
to
Yeah.
legalize or normalize
Yeah.
some of these units now, we're
Yeah,
going after them.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think there is a consensus on the council, and the staff are working hard to try to, within the confines of the current zoning and building codes, to, legalize units. And there was a consensus on the Planning Commission, I believe, and certainly on the council, to bend some of the rules, like some of the setback rules, like you could have your garage closer to the line than it was before. And the problem is that we have these rules, zoning and building rules, that are kind of designed for new construction. Like when people come and talk to us, they say, don't let people build 2-story ADUs in every backyard. What they're imagining is the change that could happen. And no one wants things to change that quickly. That's reasonable, that's understandable. We want to incrementally do more infill, incrementally add more housing. But trying to apply the rules about new housing to 30 years worth of socially acceptable housing in neighborhoods is a total disaster. I mean, you have people that are living peaceably with their neighbors for 10, 15, 20 years in ways that are completely against the rules, but are basically safe. And then, because we've put these two systems together, we're kicking them out. So my problem is not the changes to the zoning rules the city is looking into, which are kind of incremental, which I support, and I appreciate my colleagues for doing that. My problem is trying to set that standard for new building onto this, people's existing homes. And to me, I'd like to apply the idea of habeas corpus, like before we kick someone out of their house, I think there has to be a problem. We have to know that someone is negatively affected by that housing, And I think the onus right now, because of the rental inspection ordinance, the onus is on the landlords and the renters, where, if they don't fit into the system, they're the ones that are messed up. I don't think that's right. I think, the onus should be on the city. Like if people have housing that's socially acceptable, that is more or less safe, according to like a HUD, housing unit list, the onus should be on us to figure out how to bring it in the fold. So to answer your question, yes, the city is trying to bring more units into legalization. The staff are working very hard on that, and we have some specific ways in trying to do that. It's just that even if we try our very best, we'll lose hundreds and hundreds of units that just don't fit into this new system. And that's kind of the issue that is raising concern, so to speak.
I mean, just having been on the rental market myself, it's pretty brutal out there. And you reduce the supply, of course, the cost is going to go up. So.
And just the chaos too. It'd be one thing if it was incremental, but this is all happening within a short period. We had 30 years of the complaint system, and now within 5 or 6 years, we're going to try to inspect every single property, every single unit. So,
wow.
It's partly that I don't know how much supply and demand matters in this market. A few hundred units a year. There's whatever 80,000 units in the city. but there's also just the chaos it causes and the disruption of people's lives, and that's really hard for me to see.
Yeah. Well, don't worry, we got you. Yes, apparently that horrible traffic situation resolved, and multiple former city council member Mike Rotkin has just joined us in the studio.
I'm only one council member, but for multiple terms.
Multiple term council member. Okay, I thought there were different personalities in there. I guess I don't know. No, welcome, Mike Rotkin. Yeah.
Thanks for
How many
inviting me.
times were you on the council?
6.
6, and from when to when?
I started in 1979 and served 6 terms with some breaks in the middle. So
Right,
I
you have
got
to
off
take
in
the 4-year term.
Got off in 2010. So
Wow,
with a 4-year break and a 2-year break somewhere there in the middle.
somewhere. So, what's up with all these units, Mike? That sounds like your era we're talking about here.
Well, let me just say, I'm a supporter of the ADU thing, and that Mark played a major role in making that happen. I think that was a very good thing, and I think the idea of allowing people to, where it doesn't cause problems in the neighborhood, to build some accessory units, and he gave all the good reasons why the needs that get met by those units. I think it's a really good program. I think there's a little, I have a different view about whether these are all totally socially acceptable and fitting in. And in my 6 terms on the council, one of the major areas of complaints were people complaining about people building illegally and living too close to them and having problems with these units. Not the ones that were legally made and put in the right place and stuff, but the ones that people stuck in garages. And the problems are sometimes noise and conflict between neighbors, but also parking issues on the street. There's just not enough parking given how many cars people have. I mean, we can blame people for their own problem. If they didn't drive cars, we wouldn't have people fighting for parking spaces. But the reality is, most people have at least 1 car in a household. Most of them have 2. And so there's a lot of conflicts around these things. And the illegal units, again, there's this notion that somehow most of these are safe, but they're just there's some technical glitch they're not meeting. In my experience, there's a lot of very, very bad unsafe housing out there. Thousands of units. We don't know the exact number, but between 1,000 and 3,000 of them. I don't think anybody would argue with that range. And who knows exactly where in the middle of it we are. And Mark was right. Earlier, those were built because there was benign neglect. There wasn't official policy, but the council just didn't do anything about it. In many cases, I think they felt like eventually it would get dealt with, or somehow these things would be resolved. But in some areas, they thought there'd be commercial development, so why fight about it now? It's all the housing's going to go in that area anyway, like in the beach area. But for a variety of reasons, people look the other way. And then you have these illegal units, and you can have your city be any density you'd like it to be. I mean, if people want to have 2 houses on every 5,000 square foot lot, that's something you can zone that, you can do that, you can decide that's what you want to do. I don't think that would be acceptable to most of the people that live in Santa Cruz. Most people like the level of density generally that we have in our neighborhoods. And when they run for office, they often talk about protecting neighborhood integrity, and that's usually what they're talking about, is to make sure that there's not like people basically overbuilding in the neighborhoods, building too much stuff so that it doesn't feel like a safe, friendly neighborhood where people know each other and there's connections and there's open space, and we're not like things that are perfectly safe and reasonable in other cities like San Francisco, the density there would be completely unacceptable to people in Santa Cruz. It's a cultural thing, people develop it over time. So again, if the popular view shifts, it's possible to have a city that gets more density. It's not a crime in the end of the world if the council decides to go there. If the public supports it, my guess is they would not get support for that at all. People would be very upset. A lot of people would be upset, even to the point of recalling council members if they said, let's double the density in all of our residential neighborhoods. So what both I think Mark and Micah are sort of arguing here is, in the argument that we shouldn't try and bring everything up to the current codes, we should simply find an amnesty, some way to approve these things, can either continue to look the other way or look at them and say, well, this one's safe even though it violates the following 3 zoning laws or something. Yeah. Or just let's let it be there. Let's let it happen. You could do that, and then that's an argument. Let's let the people who built things illegally and didn't follow the rules, let's have them be allowed to have additional income, have another unit in their backyard, cause some additional growth pressure in terms of parking and other issues on their neighbors. And the people that followed the rules, well, they have to come in and get a permit now and do whatever, follow the rules and do what they're supposed to do. It's just not fair. I mean, the bottom line is you'd be rewarding the people that ignored the rules, that built stuff when they weren't supposed to illegally. And I don't think that's a good way for a city council to act. I think what you can do is what the city started to do. let's figure out which of the rules about zoning don't make any sense. I mean, they made sense 30 years ago, or somebody thought they did.
Yeah.
Now we look at them and we go, well, why do you need to have 3 feet on the side of a house, or 5 feet or whatever it is between, and then it becomes 5 on each side, 10 feet between houses. It used to be because firefighters needed to run back there with their hoses and stuff. Maybe the new technology of firefighting and other stuff means you don't need that much space. Or what if you had, so you could cut that back, and so a house that's like 1 foot into that setback, maybe we should change the rules and let them be approved. Maybe we should change the rules about how many, I certainly think we should change the rules about covered parking. I don't know why we need covered parking anywhere, so get rid of that rule. And a bunch of things would become legal where there's not space now for a covered parking space. Why do you need to, not let people park their cars tandem, one behind the other, because it's hard to get the inside one out? Let's go through the list. We'll find a bunch of stuff. The city council, I think, is doing that. Which of these rules really are not really necessary? And so which of these units could be, that are existing illegal units now, could be approved if we made the rules more flexible or limited the number of restrictions that exist there? Most people, not everybody, but most people think we should stick to the health and safety rules, the ones that have to do with, is the building going to be a safe place for a person to live and not be caught in a fire? I think most of the controversy is not over the building code. There's some over that, but mostly it's over the zoning. How much open space is in the backyard? How high is it? How close to the neighbor's yard? Those kinds of issues. And I'm in favor of making those more flexible, but not ignoring them and looking the other way. One of the rules, and the one that's the most controversial, I think, right now, has to do with, there's a requirement that in order to have an ADU, the owner of the property must live on the property, either in the ADU or in the main building.
Right.
And some people think, well, let's get rid of that. Let's just let two renters rent. People rent in the back, people rent in the front, not require the owner to live on the property. And my answer to that is the years I've on the council, so many people complaining about when you have problems with the ADU or the rentals or the stuff that are next to you, and you want to talk to the owner, and the owner lives on the property, it's a lot better to deal with it. If the people are making noise, the owner lives there, the owner's going to stop the noise. If the owner lives in Fresno or somewhere else in Santa Cruz on the other side of town or wherever, it's hard to get a hold of them. They don't respond. They don't give a shit. They don't care, just to be blunt about it. And on some level, the idea of requiring the owner to be there to make these particular units be ones that are not going to cause problems in the neighborhood seems to me to be a very, very good idea. And I think generally the neighborhood groups in town, the organized organizations, have argued that that's kind of a key thing to require. We got rid of the requirement that they be affordable units, because it turned out that the market price of these things was close enough to what the guidelines we were setting that it created unnecessary bureaucracy, and that was a good idea. Once we got rid of that, a lot more of them got built than before. When you had to go through a process and get it approved to make sure that you were renting it to a low-income person at the right price and everything else, a lot of people said, I'm not going to build it because I'm not going to get in the middle of that bureaucratic mess. So that was a good decision that was made to get rid of that requirement, but I don't think getting rid of the homeowner has to live on one of the 2 units on the property is a good idea, getting rid of it. So that's my quick response to the issues.
That was quite the quick response. But they got their word in first, so let's let you.
No, that's good. I feel like that's fine. I lay it's on me.
No, it's different perspectives. That's all. I saw Mark taking some notes here.
Well, this is
definitely
this is an issue I've been working on for a long time, and I think it was 20 years ago that I went to the city council and asked them to drop the affordability requirement, because as an architect I was designing ADUs, and people were saying, it's going to cost us more to build the ADU than the rent we're going to get from it,
so it was a good decision.
And why are we giving up our privacy if we're going to lose money on this? So yes, but those changes were really slow, and they're really slow. And Mike, I can understand, I can feel Mike's pain. He's on the city council, on a council that is dealing with ADUs on a complaint basis. So what Mike hears are the complaints. What planning staff hear, what Mike heard on the council and what Micah hears on the council often is not, and what I heard when I was on, were the complaints, because that's all that comes to us.
Right.
And as Mike said, 1,000 to 3,000 illegal units in the city of Santa Cruz. Mike did not hear, on his time in the council, 24 years, he did not hear 1,000 to 3,000 cases. What can we gain, what can we learn from that if we look at it objectively, is that the vast majority of illegal units did not create problems. So if it's not broken in its entirety, why do we fix it all to deal with the few that we have? Why do we change the system to fix them all, even though a small fraction of them are troublesome? So that's the situation that we shoehorned ourselves into, and that's what makes it very difficult. That's why the planning department, also responding to complaints, can't tell us whether it's 1,000 or 3,000, because the planning department is the last place you go to for advice or to talk to in terms of legalization, because they're the ones who bust you. So you stay away. So that we have this black market in housing, and it's actually worked really well. I've sat on the planning commission and the zoning board with commissioners who owned illegal units. I've sat on the city council with people who owned illegal units. It's ubiquitous in Santa Cruz. Yeah. Suddenly, there's a kind of righteousness about and people, holding up the example of this terrible unit here. We have to do something as a justification for eliminating many units. And for me, it's these are casualties. This is collateral damage. Can we afford to lose one decent unit, one unit that is a good neighbor, for the sake of some principle that we think these are bad, we think these are a problem? Well, reality shows us that the vast majority of illegal units in the Santa Cruz are good neighbors, and the people are part and parcel of their healthy neighborhoods.
What I have to say, I don't necessarily.
If I could just throw in there, having been, I think, the only tenant here at the moment, I've had a lot of experiences with people renting units that would be certainly considered illegal, and quite frankly, because they are illegal units, those are the people who are often the quietest and the meekest. They're not the ones making the complaints, because quite frankly, they're threatening their own housing. And bad housing is often better than no housing. So, I just throw that out there, kind of what you said right there.
So we have people living in fire traps who won't call and complain about it because they're afraid they're going to get booted out, or it'll get fixed and they'll raise the rent on them. And so they don't bother bringing it up. And there are a lot of those units out there that, where people are not going to complain about it. And the neighbors don't always complain, because the problem there is you get into a whole set of retaliation things that happen in neighborhoods. And so if I complain about my neighbor's issue, whatever it is, not just ADUs, a bunch of other stuff, people tend to suck it up often and just let the stuff go, because they go, well, if I complain, then the neighbor, because somebody's got something else illegal going on, or there's something happening. And so they're, or they're just nervous that the neighbor's not going to like them, or there's going to be bad feelings and bad blood and stuff. And people want to get along with their neighbors, so they tend to some people will call up immediately, or there are individuals out there that will call on turn on a dime and call right up. But there's a lot of people out there that will let stuff go because they don't want to have a conflict with their neighbors about it, even if they're bothered by it. And they'll complain. You go in the supermarket, they'll come up to you and they'll go, there's this illegal unit being built next to me, there's all these problems. And I'm saying, well, you should go tell the planning department, because they'll respond to it. And they go, oh, I'd rather complain to you. I say, well, do you want to tell me where it is? And say, well, no, because they'll trace it back to me. So they're complaining about it. They're not happy about it, but they don't necessarily turn them in because they don't want to get involved in one of these fights.
Well, what I see is kind of as a council member, it's always competing priorities, right? So I see the staff and, to some degree, Mr. Rotkin talking about the quality of housing, and that's totally reasonable, and it's somewhat important to me. But then there's the availability of housing. We have 900 homeless people in Santa Cruz. Are we, let's say we could, if we really bent and shifted and expanded zoning as much as we had consensus for, and Mike's saying we probably don't have consensus for one of the things that would most legalize units, owner-occupied, and I don't disagree with you, I understand your reasoning. But, if we could manage to get 1,000 out of those units to legalize, right? Are we really going to throw out 2,000 people in the next 3 years? To me, it's like the abstract notion of fairness or neighborhood integrity or whatever. These are all abstract notions, and they're important to me. I understand why they're reasonable. But I'm not okay with throwing 2,000 people out in the next few years. That is not a way that I want to treat the citizens of Santa Cruz. So to me, it's like, that's a hard stop. That's not acceptable. We can all get into our little debates about this law and that law and whatever, and everyone's reasonable, and the council's reasonable, and everyone's reasonable, but because of the rental inspection ordinance, we don't have the latitude to be incremental anymore, to be cautious anymore, to be careful anymore, because we're literally going out and throwing people out of their homes. So that's the problem. That's the problem.
In the next 3 years, there are 9,000 rental units in the city of Santa Cruz that are going to be inspected.
No, next 5
on-site
years.
inspections.
5 years.
I think it's 3 more, because 2 have already happened.
3 more, Mike.
No, but I mean, the point is, a lot of them are, most of the ones now are being self-certified. So it'll
Those
be
are 9,000 self-certified.
But it won't be till there's like 5 years till they actually get an
So it's
actual
either 3 or
inspection by
5.
the city.
As Micah said, a couple of those 5
In
years
less than
have already
6 years.
passed.
In less than 6 years, regardless.
So we do have a potential crisis looming, a huge crisis. And, you know, we talk about neighborhood integrity. I think it's really important, and Mike said it. If you think you're going to rely on city government to maintain your neighborhood integrity, think again. It's neighbors tolerating neighbors. I spent 11 years on the zoning board that did nothing but mediate neighborhood disputes, and I realized at some point that zoning violations actually make for good neighbors, because as long as everybody had one, a zoning violation, everyone was tolerant.
That's pretty
And
simple.
the big problem comes when after you've been there for a long
Maybe we
time.
should illegalize units instead of legalize them.
Well, what happens, and I see this all the time as an architect, is that people forget that they have violations.
Right.
And as soon as they forget they have violations, they get self-righteous about what their neighbor's doing. In some ways, this town functioned far better when everybody had and was aware of their own violations, and they sought to be good neighbors. So if we think that we can, through legislation, clean up the entire neighborhood, clean up the whole town, no, we're just going to be bringing a tremendous amount of pain. And the price of that pain is going to be the higher and higher demand for housing and the less and less housing available. So, you know, you talk about being a renter. I was a renter in this town for 17 years before I built my own house. I've been through that. I know what that's about. I don't want to forget what it's like to be a renter and to try to live here in this town when you have few resources. I also don't want to find myself in a town that's composed only of wealthy people. And that's a real threat here. When we talk about safety in housing, and again, as an architect, I suffer from a lot more knowledge than most people when it comes to codes and ordinances. The fact is that at the city of Santa Cruz, there is not a single house in Santa Cruz today that meets current building codes. Current building codes change every year. That means that if you built your house last year, it no longer meets
But Mark,
the building
that's-
codes. Well, let me just finish.
It's very misleading to say that.
Well,
though,
what's-
because,
is
because the
mis-
building department is not going to require anybody to bring their house exactly up to the current code. The reality is when they do these inspections and you
But
come
the
in,
No, you're not talking about
Yes, right?
the
Not talking about people's
the
homes,
building
rental
department
units.
does not do inspections. The building department, the rental inspection ordinance, which is outside of our zoning ordinance, has hired people with a checklist, a basic safety checklist. And I think that's a good thing. They go into existing units and they look to make sure that everything meets that. A house that was built in 1890 can meet that if it has the smoke detectors, if it has windows that operate, if it has a door of a proper size so people can
doesn't
get
have
out.
gang wires across the
Exactly.
walls and
It
shit.
can meet, it's not that difficult to meet those. However, you look at the ordinances, and people in the city are adamant on holding on to the ordinance that says that if you have an illegal unit, when we find out about it or you bring it in, we're going to treat it as though it doesn't exist. And it's going to have to meet all codes for new buildings, our current
Mark,
codes.
that is completely. This is critical.
It's critical.
That is completely false. When these people that have been hired by the city go out, because I've gone out with them.
Those aren't the people who govern the building codes.
When these people go out and look at one of these properties that's illegal, they've been called out, and that's why they're, or they're inspecting it because it's come up on the roll, and now they're going to go inspect
Okay.
it. And they see things that are illegal there. They don't tell them, oh, you've got to, for example, your stairway here is the height between the steps doesn't meet the modern code, whatever that is. It's a foot, some distance of 8 inches or something. They don't tell them, oh, tear those stairs all out and make them exactly meet the current code. They go, close enough. There's a whole lot of stuff they'll do that they totally accept, as long as it's, they're not going to let you have wiring that runs, with extension cords all through the house and stuff to have your electrical system. But when there's things like, the modern code's got all kinds of distance measures for things, and you have to have exactly, for example, a lot of old houses are built with 2x4s instead of 2x6s. There's, a bunch of that stuff. They don't make you rebuild your house to a 6-inch stud. They'll let you keep a 2x4 stud in the wall, which has been not a legal framing for a house for probably 40 years or something.
So why is it, Mike, when I suggested that we declare in our legalization program that if a building was built to code, i.e. as a garage, if it had a permit when it was built, that we declare that an existing non-conforming structure, in which case the building official can do exactly what you say, which is to go in there and say, this is an obvious hazard, I want you to fix it. The rest I can live with. I said, let's put that in our ordinance. And you know what I was told? No way, we're not doing that.
And here's why.
And you know what I was told? Because our current building codes are a minimum standard. That is the official line from our building department and our planning department.
There's
And
two
until it changes, I'm not lying, I'm not making this up.
I'm not saying you're lying.
And
Mark,
I've lived in this town, I've worked in this town for a long time. And what you said is absolutely true up to a point. Up to a point about 5 years ago, when old building officials retired, the ones who would look at a situation, who came up through the trades, who knew buildings and said, that's good enough, I can live with that. We're moving away from that, Mike. You may not have witnessed it, you may not have seen it. I've seen it. We're moving to a point where people have nothing but checklists. Our city, in the last year, all permits that people apply for, shipped over the hill to an engineering firm in San Jose. We do not do plan check. We have not done for a year plan checks, even for ADUs here. You don't have the good old boys who are looking and saying this is good enough. You have engineers who have a checklist. It's the current code, and they mark it off. I invite you to go and
Mark,
look.
So let's just say this. We may have agreement.
let me have a third
Agreement
thought.
could happen.
Hold on a minute.
If that's the case,
Let me try your perspective.
then we should look into that issue, because there's two reasons. One of which has to do with who's doing the inspections and are they being flexible. But the reason the city is not going to declare that you have a right to have it be good enough is because somebody will sue you and the city will end up in a bad financial situation. So what you need to have, as it was in the past, reasonable people doing these jobs who get a clear set of instructions of don't leave things that really are unsafe. That's a bad thing to do, and we don't want to have people die on our watch. But you need to be flexible about the way these things change. And if you're right, that there's no possibility of a person saying something other than a serious safety issue is not good enough, maybe I'm on your side.
Wait,
good.
Do some work.
I think you
but
will
you're not,
be.
But you're
I
not going
think
to
you
get
will
the
be,
city to
Mike.
declare that by right you can do stuff that's good enough. They're
San
gonna say-
Francisco did it.
They're going to say,
don't know about
they're going to give you a general comment at the end, the way they used to do it. They never used to say, go back and say, oh, it was good enough. They went back and they said, it meets the code.
I'm all for the good old days, Mike.
We still have some problems, okay? So even presuming that what Mr. Rotkin is asserting is true,
call
and
me Mike, by the way.
I think it's often, I usually do call you Mike. I think it's often true. I mean, I know that's the intention of the staff, and they have a really tough job because they're sitting with this big old code, but then the community is telling them just focus on safety. So I think I agree with Mike, at least to a large degree, that that's what they're trying to do. However, here's a real life situation. So the rental inspection went into a unit that wasn't legal because of zoning. It was officially too big for zoning and there wasn't enough parking. The unit didn't have a window for egress, which, it's a safety issue. Right? You should be able to open a window from every bedroom in case there's a fire or something to get out.
Or break it if you had to.
Or break it if you had to, right. But part of this unit, and I was in the unit, seemed to be relatively safe, but there wasn't a window. That's a problem, right? So they said, well, how do we put in a window? And they said, you can't put in a window because we can't give you a permit to put in a window because you live in an illegal unit. Right. So this is the issue, even presuming for the moment that our staff are going to behave the way Mike wants them to behave, well, I want them to behave, and I think often they do. I mostly agree with Mike on this one. I think often they are using their common sense. The problem is that a lot of these units will never be, you cannot bring them up to code.
It's a catch-22.
It's a catch-22.
But that doesn't
Mike, hold on,
exist.
please. Let him finish his point. It sounds like a catch-22, right?
It is literally a catch-22 because
You can't bring it up to code because you can't get a permit.
right. So and once the safety inspectors come in, they have a duty based on the Gordian knot we create, the catch-22 we created, to then call it in as an illegal unit. And officially, you're supposed to bulldoze it. So that's
not true.
Occupy.
Again, we have basic disagreement about facts. When an inspector goes out, let's say on a complaint, or however they get there.
No, the complaint is different because then there's legitimate problems.
Mike, when's the last time you called for an inspection? When's the last time you called for
We
an
go inspect
inspection?
your house?
Well, no, I mean, what's your point?
Well, you're telling us what happens when a building inspector goes out to a site. I'm asking you, when's the last time you were on site, where you call for inspection?
I
The
helped
building
a friend on a
inspector
house about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
So
But this is a real, the example I'm bringing up is a real live example that actually happened in the last
But when
year.
people go out, I know
Madam
this,
P.
when the building inspectors go out to look at what's been declared an illegal unit, it's illegal, it's got a bunch of violations, or it never was made legal, it never got permits. That's the situation we're talking about generally, right? They look at that situation and they say, here's the things you need to be able to fix to get a permit. You're going to have to pay your permit fees, and you're going to have to fix. They don't. It's not true. Mark, do you think this is true? That they can't say to that person, here's 10 violations. If you fix these 10 violations, you can have a permit.
No, they can with some units, but not with others.
Now, if there's something they can't fix, if let's say, for example,
That was two no's there. I mean, it sounded
no,
like
if currently
not
if currently the house is sitting on the property line under the current zoning, then they can't approve it because you can't fix that without moving the house.
Right, because zoning has nothing to do with
But the
safety,
example you
right.
gave of the window, there's no window here. In this example of no window, they have every ability to tell the person, if that's, say, the only violation, if you fix that window, you got to have it fixed. It's got to meet it has to be whatever size the window needs to be a legal egress window or whatever.
No.
And they can give you a permit for
You're missing
that.
my point. The reason they won't give them a permit in a lot of these cases, not all of them, there's some percentage they will, but a third, 2/3, depending on all the zoning rules, is because of the zoning code. They don't have parking on the property. Not enough is covered. The ADU's too big.
So now you're saying that they can't be fixed. That's a whole different
Right, no,
thing.
hold on a minute.
If I understand correctly, because I'm just speaking in layman's terms, we got three guys that are very wonk in policy here, but let me just say,
Right.
I mean, essentially, like, if you're going to renovate your house or work on your house or your ADU or whatever, you need to get a job site permit, right? I mean, is that essentially what we're talking about
called
here?
a building
The building
Right.
permit, that's there on the front of the job site, and that lets
And
your
let's say
neighbors
you
know
did-
that it's being worked on,
and
et
if you
cetera.
didn't-
But if you can't get that, it sounds like I'm hearing from Micah that you essentially can't get those when there are these violations of the zoning situation.
Right.
Hence, so even if they were trying to address the
Yeah.
safety concern, again,
Right.
the catch-22 kicks in, and they can't even do that
Yeah.
legally, properly,
Right.
And the
correctly.
building
Say
code.
every unit has to ultimately be able to meet both the building code rules,
Right.
has to have window, for example, and it has to meet whatever the
Sounds
Yeah,
zoning.
but we have
And the-
3,000 units that don't meet those
But whatever, it also has to meet whatever the zoning.
And the,
There's a compromise.
and the
Strong
building
on
department,
safety,
the building
soft on
department has
zoning.
not been tested on this yet because the zoning has been such a roadblock that it's never gotten to the building department or rarely has. But what we're talking about here is trust. And you're saying to people who own illegal units, who want to legitimize them,
They
who want to
can't.
make them safe, you're saying, come in, talk to us, bring in your plans. And in terms of whether the building official is going to say yes or no, well, here's what we can tell you. Sometimes he may say yes, and sometimes he may say no. You know how many people are going to risk coming in on that? If there's no trust, you've got a dead program.
No.
That's why I said, put it right there. Just as San Francisco did. They said, I mean, they have a very complicated rule. I'm just cherry picking the one thing that works there. They said, if the building was built with permits before a certain date, then we'll consider it existing non-conforming. And there is a building code that deals with existing buildings. And there is a fire code, an electrical code that deals with existing buildings. And if we could do that, then people would know what those codes say and what they had to do. So that's why I don't understand why our planning department is not anxious to do that. Because it makes sense.
And one thing you can do right now is go to which people do, I've done it myself, go to the counter, don't tell them what your address is and your name, and say, I'd like some advice. Here's my situation. Here's a plot of what my house looks like. How much information you want to give them. Would this be a legal unit? And they'll tell you without asking, it's not they'll say, go away, unless you tell me what your address and your name is, I'm not going to talk to you. They don't do that. I know that, I've done that myself. They'll say, oh, well, you'd have a problem here because there's 3 bedrooms and you only have 1 parking space or whatever it is. Or they say, oh, yeah, you could do that. That's totally legal. You don't have to put yourself on the line and risk being evaded.
But we still have this
Still, it's a pretty
catch-22.
small town.
It's a
We
small
still-
town, Mike.
Yeah.
Well, but even I mean, what Mike's saying is to some degree true, to a large degree true.
Well-
but even hypothetically, if it's completely true, we still have this catch-22 problem because out of these 3,000 units, I guarantee you between 1,000 and 2,000 don't meet the zoning codes. So they cannot become part of the legalized housing and have the safety thing. So we're still talking about kicking people out of their home. I want to finish. I want to say one more thing. I want to say another thing. We talk about neighborhood integrity, right? Under the old system, the complaint system, neighborhoods had different standards. And when you moved into a neighborhood, that was one of the reasons I didn't buy a house on the Upper West Side. I didn't want all my neighbors like, checking out, how my grass was cut or how, whatever. I want to live somewhere where it was more live and let live. And people chose neighborhoods based on those ideas. In my neighborhood, nobody cares if people park in front of your house. In the summer, thousands of tourists park in front of our houses. That's part of the standard of our neighborhood.
I live right next to them, it's true.
In other neighborhoods, people care a lot about that. But when we put in the rental inspection ordinance, now everyone has to have a certain amount of parking. Now, I appreciate that Mike wants to have it not be covered parking, but everyone has to have a certain number of parking because, certain neighborhoods, that's important to them. And like Mike says, in certain neighborhoods, they feel like they don't have parking, and that's fine. And in those neighborhoods, if they're stuffing tons of people into houses and building illegal ADUs and there's not enough parking, they should complain. In my neighborhood, we don't care about parking. If there's not providing enough off-street parking and everyone's parking for your house, why should the city then come in and start going through your lots and seeing if there's enough parking and throwing people out of their housing if there's not enough parking? It doesn't make sense. That's not neighborhood integrity. That is big government at its worst, and that's what we're sitting with right now in Santa Cruz.
It sounds like different not different sets of rules. I mean, it's like applying the same set of rules to very different conditions and sort of acceptable social norms.
I think it's more like where you started going, which is what's being argued here is we should be like Dallas used to be. Why have zoning? Why not simply let people build, trust that people will come to their own? And they used to believe this in Dallas. We don't have to have, let's not be stupid like Dallas. You don't want to have industrial stuff.
Actually, I think it's Houston that does.
Was it Houston? Whatever it is in somewhere in Texas. But you don't want to have industrial factory next to somebody's house. But let's assume it's a residential neighborhood. We'll agree on that. But within a residential neighborhood, let the chips fall where they will.
Can I just throw in some?
Wait a minute.
Throw in something, because
you still had a complaint-driven system.
That's not a good one.
You still couldn't get away with it if it wasn't acceptable to your neighbors.
It sounds like, if I may, I'm the new guy on the block here, politically speaking, but it sounds like essentially the city helped create a situation which it now has no idea really how to deal with. And that seems like, you're trying to, I understand the safety concerns, and I'm going to echo what I said a second ago. To me, thinking out loud, the city needs a solution that is strong on safety, but because there was such a blind eye for so long, it needs to be soft on zoning, and it needs to be about looking at how can we expedite the legalization and normalization of these units, and figure out how can we very thoroughly and promptly address the safety concerns as well.
Exactly.
Like that's all for it.
Exactly.
But you can't have a permit stopping someone from fixing a safety violation.
And I was not.
That is.
Mike and I were on the city council. We're not on the city council now. What's different now from when Mike was on, any of his 24 years, when I was on?
42 years.
All right. What is different now?
No, actually, that's not true. 30.
And it's like, for me, the big question is when we talk about our fears about non-owner occupied and how terrible this is going to be, what we have now that we didn't have then is a rental inspection ordinance.
That's the problem.
We actually have a vehicle for protecting our neighborhoods. So if the easiest thing in the world is to say, why do we want, and Mike, answer this question, why do we want to insist on owner occupied? Because the owner, if he's on the site, is more responsible, is easier to get a hold of. But we actually could say to somebody who wants to legalize and is not living on site, fine, you don't live on site, you pay for an annual inspection. And you make sure that, and we'll make sure that your neighbors are alerted to contact us. If there's continuing verified disturbances, we will revoke your permit. And that can be done. We did not have a rental inspection ordinance before. We do now. And as Mike said, we are not Houston. We have a zoning ordinance. A zoning ordinance that was written in the time of Leave It to Beaver. It's about segregating uses. You live here, you work here, you shop here. You get in your car to do everything. That's what we are trying to fix right now. We're trying to make better neighborhoods for ourselves. So what do we have? If you want to know what our policies are, look at our ordinances and ask yourself, what is the easiest thing to build in a neighborhood in Santa Cruz right now? And that question was answered for me about 2 months ago when somebody came to me and said they wanted me to design a house in a West Side neighborhood. And I said, sure, I'll come and talk to you. I like designing houses. He came, he said, I actually have sketched out a plan. And he showed it to me. I looked down at the piece of paper, I looked up and I said, you want to build a 6-bedroom house for yourself? He said, well, it's a student rental. I said, have you gone down to the planning department to ask them about this? He said, yeah, over-the-counter permits, no public notification, no public hearings. as of right. 6 bedrooms, I have to have 4 parking spaces or 5 parking spaces. I got it on my site plan.
Actually, so
The
it's
city
bedrooms
doesn't
plus
care.
one, so it'd be
That's
7
the
parking
easiest
spaces.
thing to build in Santa Cruz. Easiest thing to build in our neighborhoods is a student house. That's what
18
we have
students.
right now. So I asked people in Santa Cruz who are concerned about their neighborhoods, and I live in a neighborhood. I've got 10 neighbors that border onto my property. And 2 years ago, the people who moved in behind me actually started having children. And it was like, you know, it was like an endangered species. It was such a thrill to suddenly, you know, have small children in a neighborhood that hadn't seen children in years. What is a healthy neighborhood? A healthy neighborhood, we haven't seen healthy neighborhoods in Santa Cruz in a long time. My neighborhood is a student neighborhood, and we don't have student housing ordinances. We have ordinances that say, build them. Build those student houses, over-the-counter permits. And when we try to create diversity in our neighborhoods through ADUs and say we want elderly people here, we want young people living here, we're told this is terrible. These people are dangerous to us, and we need to clean this up. And that has been absolutely the wrong course of action, taken by city councils and planning commissions composed of landlords and property owners, and very precious few renters.
So these guys have explained the logical consequence of enforcing the existing zoning or even slightly modified zoning, which is some people will be kicked out of their houses.
Thousands.
Well, let's say.
Not just some. Thousands is an important distinction.
Many hundreds.
And because I think a lot of these units can in fact be made legal if we loosen the zoning laws up somewhat, which we have ability to do. But here's the contradiction on their side of this. You're going to say to somebody, you have a unit that's currently illegal because of zoning problems and there's some building problems. We're going to look the other way we're going to give you approval, give you existing building. Grandfather in this thing on the zoning. We're going to make you fix the safety. I assume everybody's in favor. Fix up the safety problems, and they get to do that. Now, their next door neighbor, right next to them, has the same size lot, for the sake of argument, the same size house, the same amount of open space and everything else. Do they get to just come in and build in the same illegal way, not under the current requirements of are we going to build another 3,000 illegal units? Because right now, if you let this guy do this, by what legal right do you have the right to tell the person next door, you can't do exactly the same thing? The answer is you can't do it.
Sure you can.
The person next door will sue you for unequal application of the law. They have exactly the same right as the person next door.
It's an assumption, that's a possibility, certainly.
Right.
It's not guaranteed, but that's a possibility. Micah, you're saying?
That's why for 30 years we had a complaint-driven system. If you had an unpermitted unit, it wasn't worth the same on the rental market. You didn't get all the credits. It wasn't worth $50,000, whatever. And if you didn't get along well with your neighbors, then your unpermitted unit could be taken away. And so people made decisions about whether they were going to build permitted units. And the problem is that as you said very clearly, people aren't accepting of building thousands and thousands of new units because they don't want that much more housing. That's a nuanced, incremental conversation. But no one that came to us at the city council meeting and said, I'm for the owner-occupied thing, no one said it should be applied to existing units. No one wants to throw people out that haven't had any complaints. No one wants to do that, but people don't want more and more housing. Yeah. That's why for 30 years we had the complaint-driven system. That's what we should go back to. And Mike, we should go back to the complaint-driven system. It worked for 30 years.
What's the legal basis?
I'm just going to throw it out here, guys, gentlemen. We have just about 2 minutes left, so consider this kind of your final word here. I'd like to throw in my own 2 cents to wrap things up, but yeah, let's just consider that we're very low on time.
I was on the city council that voted unanimously to direct our police department to make marijuana use and possession and sales the least priority in the city of Santa Cruz, right? Yeah, you were there, Mike. Think about all those drug dealers who never paid taxes on their sales of marijuana. Think of all those people who never took out a business license. When we did that, they got off scot-free, Mike. How do you feel about that? We're talking about what is primarily, or was then primarily, a recreational drug. And as I said to the city council, housing is a human right. So what kind of standards, what kind of double standards do we have as a community if we say we're going to punish people who provided housing, but we're not going to punish people who provided marijuana? I mean, come on, this is housing. And some of the people who created those illegal units were housing their friends, housing the people who teach in this community, artists in this community, activists in this community. They weren't, it was an act of civil
It's just 2
disobedience.
minutes, you gotta stop.
Yeah, you
gotta stop. Yeah, don't answer that question.
In fact, it's about 1 now, so I'm going to say 30 seconds, 30 seconds.
Okay, I'd
please.
like 30 seconds.
only 30
Last word.
The analogy that would be correct would be, there's a bunch of people in various places that are using marijuana, and you tell them, you now have a right to use marijuana, but your next door neighbor can't. Because you were using it before, and we look the other way, you get to keep using marijuana, but the person next door does not have a legal right to toke
Mike's
up.
final metaphor. Micah?
So I'm not talking metaphor. I'm talking the rental inspection ordinance means that we're going to kick out thousands of people out of their houses. And we haven't even tried to, so there's a huge unintended consequence. And it's not intentional, it's well-meaning, it's a huge unintended consequence. What about expanding on the complaint-driven system? What about literature in Spanish and English, rental assistance? What about a survey for every student when they move out of their home? If it's a fire trap, they're moving out anyways, they can turn that person in. That's what we should do. We should expand on the complaint-driven system to go after the unhealthy housing instead of having some kind of, expanded government that ends up with thousands of people evicted all at once.
Here, here. You know what, I could not help but think, as I was listening to all three of you, thank you so much for coming on the show. Mike Rotkin, Micah Posner, Mark Primack. Very good debate, very good ideas. I could not help but think of the kind of immigration situation.
Exactly.
And that we were talking about, oh, these people, they're the problem and this and that. And it just seems like the first step towards addressing any of that is like normalization and legalization. And yes, they committed a crime, but if you do not find a way to move past that crime, and the crime holds you back from, the alleged crime, holds you back from, moving forward, well, then you're just stuck in this problem. And I think the city, maybe intentionally, unintentionally, has created this situation that's very analogous in my mind of you need to legalize, you need to normalize, and then, then that's going to encourage more people to jump the border, right, quote unquote, or they're going to build more units. But at a certain point, we have to try something. I'm going to throw it out there, finish with that thought. I've been Sandino Gomez. Thank you so much for tuning in to Voices from the Village on community television. We had Mike Rotkin, we had Micah Posner, we had Mark Primack, 3 generations of city council talking about housing here in Santa Cruz. So I want to thank you so much. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Good luck in that rental market, folks. Have a good night.